If you're looking for a return to normalcy after last week's one-deck formatted duels of Runeterra, we've got a couple of options for you. We've got the Team IQ 3v3 if you do want to keep things a little bit spicy, playing in a unified event, which I'll get into the format of that in a second here. And we've also got the Online League series firing off in your normal, standard, 3-deck, 1-ban, region-locked, comfort, conquest format, which, for those of you that want to play a normal format, you can go ahead and play in the OLS, or if you couldn't find two teammates for the 3v3. Now, we've seen 3v3 tournaments before in official Riot capacities from the King of Runeterra, but this format's going to be a little bit different. Rather than 5 pseudo-region-locked decks for you and your teammates to pick among, each player can only bring one deck, and it can't share any cards with any deck in any of their teammates' decks. So, unified tournament, bring 3 decks, play a best of 5, winner moves on. The players will not be playing at the same time, that is also important to note. Instead, it'll be sort of like one of those cool team events where, you send one player forward and then 2 of you get to whisper in their ear and try to talk through their plays and things like that. So it'll be a lot of fun if you found a couple of teammates to play in that with. This is the first tier list based tournament tactician since the release of Monuments of Power, so I'm going to get into a couple of the differences between unified and region locked in terms of lineup going into this weekend, but for the most part we're going to focus on lineups because not a whole lot of new decks ended up coming out of Monuments of Power, but let's get into it. While Monuments of Power had some cool cards, we didn't really see anything to upset the hierarchy of Noxus Bilgewater, Targon Lee Sin, and Freljord Shadow Isle. That said, we have seen a couple of chinks in the armor for the Targon Lee Sin deck, and in fact, it's really not as popular as it once was. We're seeing a lot of triple aggro lineups come out to pick on it. We're even seeing some mid-range lineups just start to completely hose the Lee Sin deck. Twisted Fate Swain, despite the release of Nopify, still seems to have a pretty okay matchup against it, at least on camera from what I've seen over the last couple of weeks. Warmother's Control and TLC never really had a bad time with Lee Sin, not as bad as you would expect them to, that's for sure. And now Karma Lux is once again coming out of the woodworks to help you round out a lineup to pick on the Targon Lee Sin deck. Karma Lux is still a little bit of a dark horse, but I am optimistic about it. We saw Cephalopod actually pick up a win in a tournament earlier this format with it, and I've been trying it out myself, and it does feel like it has a really good spread of matchups. Concerted Strike really helps deal with the constant barrier that Lee Sin is getting, and because you are Ionia, you do still have some additional tools to pop through the Bastion that Demacia typically struggles with. But with all that said, and for all it's worth, Targon Lee Sin is still a very powerful deck. We're seeing a lot more Zed now that Nopify has released, and you get to play towards that strategy a little bit safer. Diana has pretty much fallen off. It's mostly Zed, a little bit of Diana, almost no mono at this point. People really have gotten off the mono plan, and we're still not seeing a lot of Celestial generation. I think that's part of the reason, without Solari Priestess in the main, you're not finding as many Written in the Stars. Getting the Lee Sin solely off of that doesn't matter as much, so players really feeling comfortable to lean on that alternate win con rather than going for the Celestials. Down in Tier 2, we've got Ramsol. This deck is still, it's a little bit popular, not super popular. People are still playing around with it, but it is still probably the best Aurelion Soul deck in the format, as the Dragon decks have even started to realize Aurelion Soul doesn't do as much for them as they would like. A 10-mana 10/10 really doesn't compare to the mid-range style of deck. It's just a little bit too high-end. You'd rather just have an Infinite Mind Splitter more often than not. Frostbite midrange, still a very popular choice. I think that there are just a lot of players who think this deck is still just, either they're a big fan of it, they like the Frostbite effects against Targon, they don't want to play Bilgewater Noxus or anything like that. I don't know, Frostbite midrange is still doing a lot of work, but it does still have a few weaknesses. It's still a very linear deck. Shen Fiora getting bumped down here because Karma Lux, I would assume, is actually going to overtake it this weekend. I don't know how many people know about the Karma Lux deck, so it's a little bit hard to say for sure, but I would imagine that the top players are going to be on this one, as opposed to something like the Shen Fiora. If you're playing in a region-locked tournament and you're going for a triple aggro lineup, Shen Fiora is kind of the weakness in your armor if you're looking to pick on the Targon Lee Sin. It can get the job done, but it doesn't have nearly as good a matchup as your Noxus aggro deck or your Nightfall deck. Scouts is another option, but also once again kind of a weak link. The Demacia decks are just a little bit too tempo-based to have a great matchup against the Lee Sin, especially given how impossible it is for you to actually deal with something like Bastion and be able to kill the Lee Sin effectively. Nab has fallen off in popularity, but is still kind of up there in power level. Deep is something that a lot of players are starting to come back around on, but I've still got it down in Tier 2 because I don't love its Targon Lee Sin matchup. The Shadow Isle stuff is okay at removing Lee Sin, but where the TLC and Warmothers really shine is the flash freezes and the harsh winds to be able to stop those OTKs just a little bit longer. Nightfall, and Discard aggro really still coming out to pick on the Lee Sin, though Discard, with PNZ being so open, some people are starting to just play Discard aggro in a couple of lineups. I think that the power level of this deck is sort of getting back up there. People are starting to really like this one again, and the University of Piltover is popping up in a couple of lists, but it's not mainstream just yet. I don't know why I still have TF Ezreal on here. Endure Spiders is just the worst Targon Lee Sin matchup among the Freljord Shadow Isle decks, so we're really not seeing it that often. Karma Ezreal, I was going to take off of here as well, but I just checked the Fight Night deck lists, and our previous winner, Deech, is running Karma Ezreal, so we'll have to see how he does. I do think it is still not that great, though, but, you know, maybe it pairs well into the format. Zombie Ashe continuing to fall off in favor of the War Mothers and the TLC. The Harrowing, just not a consistent win con against all of the denies coming out of Targon Lee Sin, and now Karma Lux popping into the meta. We've got more and more Ionia decks that can go ahead and try and stop that one out. Dragons is a deck that people still haven't figured out. I don't know what you would even put in a dragon deck. A lot of people... Shyvana's getting run, but she's only getting run with a couple of dragons. Generally, when we're seeing her, it's like Shyvana Screeching Dragon, that's it. They're not always necessarily playing Targon either. I've seen a couple of Scouts decks that just play Shyvana Screeching Dragon, so I'm not even sure what you exactly mean when you say a dragon deck. If you do just mean, you know, load in the mobilizes, load in the reduced cost cards, then yeah, you're not going to have a great time, especially because it is a pretty big compromise to take your Targon away from your Lee Sin. And then we have the new Starspring deck. This is... You know, sometimes it's Tom Kench. I think people are starting to switch over to the Twisted Fate as well. In a region-locked format, I don't love this deck because it is a really big consideration to take your Bilgewater Targon off the table. Granted, you do still have really good decks available to you. You still get to play a Freljord Shadow Isle alongside it. And while you don't get Noxus Bilgewater, you can go ahead and run something like Shen Fiora or Karma Lux to go ahead and round out your lineup. And then if you are actually playing in a unified format, the Bilgewater overlap is pretty minimal. If you don't play Krusty Codger or Betty Croker in your Twisted Fate Swain deck, you can still go ahead and run that, and there's definitely no overlap between something like this and Pirate Aggro. So let's get into what lineups are going to look like. Until we get a patch update to actually knock one of these titans of industry off the top, I see no reason why Bilgewater, Noxus, Shadow Isle, Freljord, and Targon Lee Sin wouldn't be the most popular lineup going into the weekend. All of these decks are just extremely powerful in their own right. Lee Sin got some cool new tools in Nopify. Bilgewater, Noxus, especially the Twisted Fate Swain, got Betty Croker and Krusty Codger. Nothing really new came for the Shadow Isle Freljord, but it was such a dominant force beforehand that it really didn't need it, and unless we get a patch that is going to fix this, I don't see this getting knocked off as the top lineup anytime soon, but I have heard rumors that there have been confirmed nerfs coming up for Make It Rain and Lee Sin, so we'll see how that goes. And this applies to both Unified and Region Locked. And of course, if you don't like the Lee Sin deck or you're looking to pick on it a little bit harder, you can replace the Targon Lee Sin with Karma Lux like I had mentioned, though I don't think that's going to be a super popular adaptation. Karma Lux tends to fly under the radar, especially because it hasn't had a big performance in a tournament just yet, and I think this will kind of be the breakout weekend for it, though I'm not expecting the popularity on it to be super high. There were no breakout aggro decks for Monuments of Power, so I would expect the standard lineup of Pirates, Nightfall, and Discard to be your aggro lineup going into the 3v3 tournament for Team IQ. If you are playing Region Locked, then obviously you can't play Discard and Pirate together, and it is optional to either swap out the Pirate for Scouts or swap out the Discard for something like Shen Fiora, or really any anti-Targon Lee Sin deck. That's really what you're looking to do with an aggro lineup, is pick on the Targon Lee Sin, because it doesn't have a phenomenal matchup against you. It's gotten a little bit better with things like Nopify, as it does deny some of those big over-the-top spells like Noxian Fervor that's going to help deny some lifesteal, but overall, you're really just looking to beat the Lee Sin with this lineup. So if you want to fill this out with something that you think has a very good Lee Sin matchup, for example, Karma Lux, I know I'm talking about Karma Lux a lot for how much we're not going to see it, but I do want to sort of point out that it does have a good Lee Sin matchup, and that's one of the reasons it's in the meta. But yeah, if you want to run anti-Lee Sin, Pirate, Nightfall, Karma Lux, it's not out of the question. You don't have to run triple aggro. You just have to understand that you are looking to pick on one of the slower decks in your opponent's lineup. And then, of course, real quick, I wanted to show you guys what I would run if I were entering a tournament this weekend. I would go with Karma Lux, Noxus Nab, and War Mothers. Noxus Nab probably isn't quite as powerful as Twisted Fate Swain, but it is a deck that I've been enjoying a lot more. War Mothers over TLC is really just a preference. I really like Alpha Wild Claws in addition to the deck, and then, of course, the Karma Lux that I've been talking up. As I had previously mentioned, this is also a pretty good lineup to try and slot the Soraka Tom Kench deck into, if that is something that you're really a big fan of. Personally, I haven't played the deck yet. myself, and when I've played against it, I've actually got an XO win rate against it. I just haven't lost to that deck before. Primarily, I've played Twisted Fate Swain against it, but I have played a spread of decks, so I mean, based on my experience, it doesn't seem to have a good Twisted Fate Swain matchup, which I do still expect to be the most popular Noxus Bilgewater deck, so we'll have to see how it goes. It's not being played in Fight Night tonight, so, you know, it really hasn't picked up popularity even in the tournaments where you can run it, but who knows? Maybe it gets broken out this weekend since the Bilgewater overlap is minimal. Maybe somebody's really a big fan of that deck and they'll bust it out. I'm excited to see it. So it's a little bit lighter of a tournament Tactician than I would have hoped for after the release of a set, but hey, you know, if it takes a patch to knock some of these off the top, I understand. Deep and Frostbite midrange really ran the meta for a while before they had to get taken down a peg, so we'll have to see how it goes, and I am excited to see what we do end up seeing. Personally, for the Lee Sin fix, I think I'd run a Twitter poll, and I had recommended just removing the Overwhelm from Zenith Blade and giving some kind of other comparable buff to it, because let's be honest, it doesn't see play outside of the Lee Sin deck, and I think that Overwhelm is the toxic interaction with them. You still have Crystal Ibex in Targon if you really want to go for the Overwhelm, but, you know, I ran a poll to see how it would go. It was actually pretty close. I think it was like 45% of people thought that that was too much and it would kill the deck. Like 35% of people thought that that was enough, and then another like 20% were like, oh, you know, that just doesn't do anything. The deck could still be insane. So it looks like there's some mixed opinions out there. I do know that they had addressed that they're probably nerfing Lee Sin, which I would assume means bumping him up to 5 mana, which personally I don't think does anything, but hey, you know, what do I know? But anyway, guys, that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and until next time, good luck in your tournaments.